command line tips, tricks, and gotchas. In this nugget, we're going to look at some of the little tiny things that tend to drive you nuts until you figure out what they're doing. This way you'll be able to figure them out quicker, and they won't drive you nuts for quite so long. We'll talk about the difference between a single quote and a double quote in PowerShell, and I'll show you some tricks for really making them work to your advantage. We'll talk about escaping characters and escape sequences in Windows PowerShell. You've previewed this already, but we'll talk more about tab completion and command history in PowerShell. We'll look at the difference between the path and literal path parameters in Windows PowerShell, and I'll show you a really cool technique that I like to use a lot called transcripts. Finally, we'll talk about the different behaviors you might see when you're using PowerShell in different consoles. I showed you earlier how Windows PowerShell is a little bit sensitive to spaces and so forth in its commands. It treats spaces as a delimiter, and it really doesn't want to see spaces used for anything but a delimiter. And that's where quotation marks come into play. I even mentioned earlier that you could use single or double quotation marks pretty much interchangeably, and that's basically true, but there's a little bit more to the story than that. For example, if I'm changing to program files, and I put that in single quotation marks, that'll work just fine. Let me change back to the root. If I do the exact same thing again in double quotation marks, that'll work just fine too. The trick is, what if I'm in a type of storage, like the registry, where a single quotation mark is actually a legal character in a key, or as PowerShell sees it, in a folder name? What you don't want to wind up with is a situation where you're trying to CD into something like Don's software. See, PowerShell is going to see the DON as the string, as the folder name, because it's enclosed in these single quotes. The S space software single quote is going to wind up confusing it. This is one of the reasons that PowerShell lets you use single quotes or double quotes. If I need to use a single quote as a literal character, then I just include the whole thing in double quotes. By the same token, if I've got something like say hello, and I need those double quotation marks to be literal characters, I can just include the entire string in single quotation marks. And that way PowerShell will just treat these double quotes as literal characters. So that's kind of a nice little trick to have up your sleeve. As I said, for the most part, most people will usually, is that enough qualifiers for you? For the most part, most people will usually use single quotation marks. And in fact, if you just start typing and you start using the tab completion, PowerShell will use single quotation marks by default. If you want and you use double quotation marks, PowerShell will stick with you on that if you started out that way. So just knowing that you can use either of those anytime you need to is a real key thing. Just don't try to include the same type of quote in quotation marks. Don't try to include a single quote in single quotes. Single quotes go in double quotes just so that PowerShell, and quite honestly so that you can tell the difference. Now let's talk about escaping characters. I've said a couple times that PowerShell treats a space as a special character. So if I try to run cd program space files, it gets confused because it thinks the space is delimiting something different. Now, one way to get around that is to include everything in quotation marks, because everything in quotes, either single or double, will just be treated as a literal character. So the space is no longer a delimiter, it's just part of this string of characters. Another way, though, is to use PowerShell's escape character, which is the backtick. On your keyboard, it's usually on one of the upper leftmost keys, either the very upper leftmost key or the key right under the escape. It shares the same key as the little squiggly tilde sign, and it looks like that. It's kind of a tough character. You know, if you're looking at the screen, depending on the font you've selected, or even worse, if you're reading a book or a magazine, it can be really difficult to tell the difference between the backtick and the apostrophe or single quote mark. But there they are next to one another, so you can see there is a little bit of a difference. What this does is it tells PowerShell that I'm escaping, in this case, the space character. So it takes away the special meaning that the space character normally has. The space character is no longer going to be a delimiter, it's just going to be a literal space. And since it's no longer a delimiter, the command will work fine. There's a lot of different uses for this. For example, here's where I've gotten myself into trouble. Let's say I'm typing a command, dir, and I want to recurs, and maybe the command is getting really long, and you'll especially see this in books and magazines when you're typing code from those, because they're limited on their width because of the printed size, the size of the page. So when they get to the end, they'll put on a backtick. And the backtick is now escaping the carriage return. And when I type this into the shell, you'll notice that the prompt itself changes. It's no longer giving me my current path. It's just two angle brackets. And this is PowerShell's way of visually telling me that, hey, you weren't done with that line. You're typing on a new physical line, but I'm going to consider it to all logically be part of the same line. So I could type more parameters, star.dll, and the trick is now getting yourself out of this mode, because when I hit enter, I'm still in this crazy prompt mode. Maybe if I hit enter again, now it worked. So I'll hit Control-C to interrupt that, and we'll scroll back up to the top so you can see what I did. I typed dir-recurs space backtick. The backtick took away the special meaning of carriage return. Normally, carriage return means this is the end of the line, do what I told you to do. I took away that special meaning, so now it's just a literal carriage return. It took me down to the next line. So I typed a little bit more of the command, hit enter again, and PowerShell kind of gave me the opportunity to stay in that mode. When I hit enter on a blank line, it took all of this and executed it. You can see that it did recurse subdirectories, and it did apply my filter. So all of this was taken to be part of the same command. What I've done, and this is kind of embarrassing, but you might wind up doing it too, is I've accidentally done this, and then I've realized I didn't want to be here, and I don't want to do anything now. I just want to stop. Well, remember, I told you there's a key press that'll get you out of trouble. Control-C. So if you find yourself in that indented prompt, that'll get you out of it. Here's another way you can wind up getting yourself in that indented prompt. Dir, program, and instead of hitting the space now, my finger jumps over and hits return. Well, PowerShell knows that I had opened a quotation mark. And since I haven't closed it yet, it assumes I'm not finished, so it's going to automatically go into this nested prompt mode. Now you can try and see if you can figure it out and get it fixed. Oh, illegal characters and path. Yeah, that's because right here there's a carriage return, and you're not allowed to have a carriage return in a path name in Windows. So if you get into that situation, especially with quotation marks, you've typed this, you've got the prompt, just kind of give up. Press Control-C, get yourself out of it, and then start typing your command again. A little bit easier that way, keeps you out of trouble, and definitely keeps it a little simple. You don't have to guess what you're doing. Now, as a command line interface, PowerShell obviously involves a lot of typing. And so Microsoft tries to give you some ways to kind of reduce the typing load. One way is to learn shorter commands. Instead of typing dir, go with the Unix guys and type ls. It's one character shorter. A better way is to, for example, use tab completion. If I type cd, I can hit tab, and it'll automatically start filling in file and folder names from the current folder. It'll even put quotation marks around the ones that need it. That'll work on almost any command. I could type del and start, better be careful with that. I could type dir, that's a little safer, and just find a folder name like program files. So that's one area of tab completion. Another area is to finish command names. In an earlier nugget, I showed you the command get execution policy. Well, if I type get-e, get-e, and hit tab, it starts to auto-complete or tab complete any command which might match that. Get event log is the first one that matches get-e. There's get execution policy with a second press of tab. And if I keep tabbing, it'll just cycle between all the available choices. This isn't a bad way to discover what types of commands PowerShell has. Get-acl, alias, authenticode signature, child item, get command. There's a couple better ways to discover commands that I'm going to show you in the next nugget, but for right now, just know that this tab completion is there for you. It'll also work with parameter names. So dir-recurs, if I press tab, it'll finish that in. It'll even correct the casing so it's an uppercase R, so it looks nice and pretty. The other option you've got, of course, is the command history, the command buffer. I showed you earlier that if you go to the Properties menu of this window, you can change the size of the command buffer. It starts off at 50. And you get to that just by pressing the up and down arrow keys. So you can recall a previous command or recall one of the commands that you ran underneath that. Something that most folks don't realize is that you can actually press F7 to call up a complete list of all the commands. Scroll right through, find whatever one you want, hit enter, and it'll not only select that command, it'll automatically run it for you. So that way if you find yourself scrolling up and up and up and oh man, where was the one I was after? It's not that big a deal. Just press F7 and pull up the list, and it's a little easier to scroll through this list since you can kind of see all the commands right up in front of your face. One of the problems that Microsoft had to deal with when they were creating Windows PowerShell is the problem of wildcard characters. Now you're probably used to being able to type something like dir p star, star being a wildcard that stands in for any number of characters, and you get results, so anything that starts with P shows up in the list. You may also be familiar with the question mark. So P question mark question mark question mark logs. Each question mark stands in for one character, and so perf logs is the only thing that matches there. These work fine in the file system only because the star and question mark characters are not legal characters in a file name. I'll show you what I mean. I'll open my demo folder, and I'm going to try and rename test.ps1 to test question mark. And as soon as I type the question mark, Windows comes up and says a file name cannot contain any of the following characters, and star and question mark are two of the characters that it cannot contain. That way, the operating system can always tell when you're using a wildcard. If you're using a star, well, it must be a wildcard because it's not a legal character in a file name, so there's no other reason for you to use a star. Problem is that's only true for the file system. And remember that Windows PowerShell now treats all these other forms of storage as a file system, sort of. They look like drives at least. So that if I go to HKey current user, a question mark is valid here. Let me CD software. See if we've got anything good. Oh, there's not much here, so we've got a place to stick something in. Let's go to regedit. You can see me do this in the GUI here. I'm going to go to the same location, HKey current user, and I'm going to go under software, and I'm going to create a new key, and we're going to call it is this a key? Question mark. And that works fine. And if I go back into the shell and get a directory, there it is. Is this a key? So now PowerShell has kind of a conundrum. Does it treat the question mark as a literal character, or does it treat it as a wildcard? Well, to avoid that, the commands that work with the file system and the registry and everything else have got two different parameters. When you run something like dir star, you're actually running dir-path star. The name of the parameter is path. The value of the parameter is star. You don't have to include -path because the first value is always taken to be the -path parameter. But there's another one called -literal path. With literal path, star and question mark are not treated as wildcards. So if I say -literal path star, nothing shows up because there is no key or folder with star in the name. So in the registry, if I'm going to need to manipulate files and folders or keys and items that have wildcard characters in them, I can do so with the literal path, because the literal path will not try to translate these characters as wildcards. It'll just treat them as their literal characters. You can do the same thing at the regular file system, like on my C drive, dir literal path star, it just doesn't make any sense at the file system because these characters aren't legal in paths in the file system. But if you're going to be working with other forms of storage, Active Directory, the environment, the registry, whatever else you happen to hook up to PowerShell to make it see other forms of storage, knowing that that literal path parameter is there can definitely save you a lot of time and grief. And the last trick I want to talk about is something called a transcript. I've been typing a lot of stuff here in the shell. And maybe what I'm typing is implementing some kind of administrative task or business process. I'm getting a list of processes maybe on my computer, getting a directory of a particular folder on my computer, maybe program files. And I'm getting all this output, which maybe I want to capture, but I'm also getting all these commands. And maybe I want to build a script out of those commands so that I can repeat this process over and over and over and not actually have to retype the commands. PowerShell gives you a good way to do both of those things. Capture everything that appears in the command window and capture every command that you type. It's called a transcript. Start transcript, and then just give it a file name, trans.txt. Transcript is started. The output file is trans.txt. Well, that's good, since that's what I told you. So let's run ps, and then maybe we're going to run get event log security, something I showed you in an earlier nugget. Something I didn't show you is one of the cool parameters it has. Just give me the newest 20. And then a dir of program files. Now let's stop the transcript. Oh, do you remember where I saved that? Do you remember the file name? I have sat with the shell open for as long as a week while I was kind of working through a particular process or a problem. And I wasn't working on it continually. You know, I'd do my work, and then when I had some time, I'd come back and I'd mess around in the shell a little bit. By the end of the week, I couldn't remember where I had told it to put the transcript. I was kind of worried that if I stopped it, some file would be somewhere on my system and I'd never be able to find it. Well, when you run stop transcript, it reminds you of where you put that file, trans.txt. Okay, let's open that in Notepad, trans.txt. So I've got everything that appeared in the shell. If the output is what I cared about, there it is. If I wanted to turn those commands into a script, all I would need to do is delete everything else in the text file, only keeping the commands. There are actually some scripts out there in the world. You might look on scriptinganswers.com for one that will do this stripping automatically for you. It'll take everything out for you. Once I've done that, all I have to do is save this. We'll call it myprocess.ps1. Put a ps1 file name extension on the end of it. Now I can come and actually run that script, myprocess, and repeat that process over and over and over and over to do whatever I need it to do. So it's kind of a really useful way of taking a task that it's maybe taken you a long time to flesh out and really get working correctly and turn it into a repeatable process. Transcripts are also a great way to save all this output. If you're in a class or maybe you're following along with a webcast or something like that and you're learning how to do stuff, a transcript is a great way to capture that entire experience so that you can go back and view it later. Transcripts are really useful. I think they're probably an overlooked piece of functionality in the shell, but now that you know about them, you can sort of remind yourself to use them when the time is right. The last gotcha I want to cover is the idea of different consoles in Windows PowerShell. For example, if I just run Windows PowerShell, let's just call this PowerShell.exe, because that's the name of it. Remember, though, in an earlier nugget I explained that Windows PowerShell actually uses many different types of user interfaces. That command line interface window is just one of them. Remember that PowerShell sits in the center. PowerShell is that administrative engine. So this is PowerShell. And that command line interface window, the blue window with the white text that we've been using, is just one way of getting to PowerShell's functionality. There are some third-party consoles. There's an editor, an integrated development environment called PrimalScript. There's another one called Power GUI, GUI. There's another one called PowerShell Plus. All of these act as another console into the shell. And you may find that when you're using one of these, the behavior of the shell, the things it's doing, seems different from when you're using the regular console window that you're used to, the blue window with the white text. That's because the PowerShell engine itself doesn't set up a lot of the defaults. The PowerShell engine, for example, does not run profiles. So if you have a profile script, that's actually being loaded by the PowerShell.exe console host. So when you run PowerShell.exe, it loads up the PowerShell engine and tells the PowerShell engine to execute your profiles. Other consoles might not have that same behavior. They might look for different profile file names. They might not load profiles at all. They might give you an options dialog box where you tell it what profiles to use. So be aware that although all of these things are using the common PowerShell engine under the hood, they may be wrapping different functionality around that shell. Things like profiles, certain pre-configured default behaviors, things like that. So it's possible to see slightly different behavior across the command line console, these different editing programs, other applications that might use Windows PowerShell. It doesn't mean anything's broken. I just wanted you to understand how this is working under the hood so you know that there's a reason for that different behavior. In this nugget, we looked at some of the gotchas, the tips and the tricks that'll make PowerShell a lot easier for you. We looked at the difference between single quotes and double quotes, and I gave you some tips for using those. I showed you some of the different escape sequences and characters that Windows PowerShell supports. And we looked at PowerShell's tab completion and command history, two things that can save you a lot of typing if you get yourself into the habit of using them. We looked at the difference between the -path and the -literal path parameter that shows up on a lot of the different commands in PowerShell. We looked at transcripts, how to start them, how to stop them, and how to kind of take your activity in the command window and turn it into a script for later use if you want. And finally, we talked about the difference between the different ways in which you might run PowerShell, the different consoles, and how their behaviors might differ. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.